Hi, everyone. Back today, continuing our showcase of contributors to the first issue of the Metamodern Theory and Praxis Journal. Joined again by Jason Ananda Josephs of Storm, co-founder, co-editor of the journal. And today we're talking to Lena Rachel Andersen, who wrote a piece for the first issue entitled Polymodern Economics. And so we would love to chat a little bit with Lena and hear about her piece and what she's trying to convey there. And yeah, just generally deepen into engagement with the work that people are putting out through this new journal that Jason and I are putting out. So anything to add to that, Jason? Anything you want to throw in the mix here?
Yeah, I just want to welcome Alina here to this conversation and say how excited I am to talk to you, and just to encourage you to kind of do a run up to it that can go as basic as you need to. This is a good excuse to tell us some really basic stuff, because my sense is also that readers of the journal so far, or many other contributors, are more likely to be in the broadly speaking philosophy or religious studies world, and not so much the economics or political theory world where you're making your intervention. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the work, and just to kick it off, maybe what do you how are you using the term polymodernity, and why do you think it is crucial for understanding economics, contemporary economics? Yeah.
I mean, you can absolutely understand the current economics without polymodernity, and that's one of the problems because we have a dysfunctional economy. I mean, the economic model that we have solved one set of problems. It's about 200 years old, 500 years old, depending on when you start counting. Um, it fed a lot of people, millions of people. We used to have starvation and poverty and a lot of unpleasant life circumstances in the West. We stole a lot of stuff in the rest of the world, um, but we have an economic model that has solved one kind of problems, and now it's creating another kind of problems. Uh, it doesn't have an internal sort of stop button that allows it to not capitalize everything around it, including nature and humans and our emotions and our relationships, which means that nature doesn't thrive anymore. Humans don't thrive anymore. You have a horrible uh, homelessness crisis in the US. You got a drug crisis. You got all kinds of crises, and you have a rapidly growing GDP. And from the way that uh, economists tend to look at national economies, your economy is a success. But if you look at street level and go to the Rust Belt, people are not thriving. So something is wrong with the current economic model. And what I wanted to do was to create a different way of understanding and describing the economy so that we can measure some different things. And perhaps, I mean, you get what you measure. So if we measured something other than what we're measuring now, which is typically employment, unemployment, and GDP, um, we could probably create a different kind of economy. So that's what I'm suggesting. And I call it polymodern economics. And the periodical here, the magazine is called Metamodernism and Theory and Practice. So, what is the difference between metamodernism and polymodernity? I think I will start there because that'll at least, I hope, remove one item of confusion. So, metamodernism is a philosophy, an approach, whatever you want to call it, has different expressions and interpretations, but it's mainly about the modern and the postmodern. And it's very much a time that we're already in, and it's a sentiment, and it's a movement in the arts, and a tons of stuff. And it's been discussed and described for the past 10, 15, 20 years, perhaps even earlier. But as an academic field, it's probably what, 2, 3, 5 years old, something like that. So and I have been writing about that for a while as well. And then I realized that if I wanted to deal with the things that I wanted to deal with, like the economy, for instance, and describe the full human experience, I needed to include what was before the modern world. And as I dug into that, there was the traditional, or what you could call a pre-modern world. And then before that, there was something indigenous that was different from the medieval era, the Iron Age, and the Bronze Age, and the big civilizations. There was all this hunter-gatherer past basically 300,000 years in the Stone Age. And without even studying it in a lot of depth, I knew that there was a huge difference between being a 150 people hunter-gatherer tribe on the African savannah or anywhere else in the world, could be the Inuits in colder climates, and a ring-walled city with 50,000 people and a demigod as a monarch. So what would be the structural differences between these? And then I decided to um, divide history up into four. I call them chunks. It's a very academic term. So there's the indigenous era, which is the first cultural code, which has hunter-gatherers, Stone Age, and then early horticulture and agriculture, villages still in the Stone Age. And then there's the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, which is the traditional era. And then there's the modern age and the postmodern age. And I wanted to combine them and insist that we can learn from all of them, and that all of them bring something crucial to what it means to be human. And the 300,000 years that we spend in the Stone Age, that is what our brains are that came from, and who we are, and our emotional and social needs are to be in these tight-knit little communities and gathering around the campfire in the evening and talking about what we experience today, and chit-chatting and laughing and talking and sharing meals and um, passing on the knowledge to the next generation. And a lot of education of the children would be taken care of by other children who took care of the younger kids. And so it's a different kind of world, and we still have those needs. And then with the bigger the I mean, as people settled, as they develop new technologies, and if we look at the Middle East, or China for that matter, but the Middle East is where I've been focusing my attention the most. About 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, we have the first sort of early Bronze Age and city uh, cities of 5 to 10, maybe 20,000 people, I think, and then they grow to 50,000 people, and then we get into the Iron Age about 300 and 3,500 years ago. It's like 1,500 before the Common Era. And that's when we get cities with 50,000, 100,000 people. Rome has 1 million people around year one. China is about 100, 200 years sort of after what happened in the Middle East. And there's a trade in the climate belt from, what would that be? Italy, Greece, across the Middle East through India and to China. So that's where we have the axial age. And in the 800s to 300s before the Common Era, that is where we have the axial age, and that's where what we know as religion today takes form. And so we have Judaism, Greek mythology, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and a couple of other things emerging and developing, and writing down their text, or gathering their main opuses that we are still reading and referring to. And there's so much cultural heritage in it, and there's so much poetry and aesthetics and beauty, and struggling with the big moral dilemmas, and how do you become a whole person, a whole human being in a city of complete strangers, and how do you become a moral person who can be trusted, and how can we as a society be sure that everybody behaves even when nobody is watching? So we tell them that God is watching no matter what you do, and no, even if nobody else is there, God will always keep an eye on you. And so if people internalize that, they will behave even when nobody else is around, we hope. So you have these new kinds of um you could call it communication technologies and strategies. Writing is invented, and different kinds of media for writing and passing on written information. And then as societies grow, and I won't get into a lot of detail, at some point Gutenberg invents the printing press with movable type, and then you have a completely different kind of distribution of knowledge, and the power structure in Europe collapses, and we have Protestantism competing with the Vatican over the political power, and there's a completely new economic structure. There's a new political fabric, everything changes and we get the modern world. And eventually, about 50 years ago, 100 years ago, we have postmodernism that just deconstructs everything. And in the modern world, we develop modern science, we develop capitalism, we industrialize, develop democracy, human rights, equal rights for men and women, and science and the right, if not the obligation, to doubt things and check where knowledge comes from. And then postmodernism, we just deconstruct everything. And all of these experiences are necessary in the complex world that we're in right now. And so when I decided to change the word from metamodernism, and Brendan asked me, "Are you jumping ship?" I was like, "No, not really. I just need another word so that we don't get into this confusion all the time, where I write about metamodernity and refer to this whole 300,000 years of historical heritage, and everybody else writes about metamodernism and talk about the past 100 years or something like that." And I ended up spending a lot of energy on defining what I was not talking about instead of writing, for instance, an article like this one about the polymodern economics. So, and it wouldn't have made sense to call this metamodern economics, because that would have sort of referred to, or people would have thought, oh wow, modern, postmodern economy. But isn't that what we already have? And yes, it is. So I decided to change the name, and I think it's been really useful for what I do, and I hope it has helped everybody else too, because then we can talk about the two different things and still have them in the same publication. So I think that was without getting into the economics, that was my opening for this
Yeah.
topic.
Awesome. No, that's great. Great context. And yeah, and two, I mean, polymodernity, polymodernism is another one of these terms that can, help us do certain kinds of sense-making work. One of the things about this journal, is that it does, in a sense, engage with different ways, different approaches to talking about what is sort of beyond postmodernism, but by means of postmodernism. And I see your work doing that very intentionally, trying to like integrate the aspects of the value of postmodern deconstruction, but while also situating it within sort of a broader context that can, do what it is, do the kind of work that needs to be done in that mode, but also recognize the kind of plurality or the polyness of these different aspects of cultural codes, as you call them. So yeah, and this journal in some ways is navigating some of that polyvalent, polyvocal aspects of how people are deploying these different paradigms, and hopefully having some interesting conversations kind of across those ways of talking about it. Were you going to say something, Jason? I didn't mean to.
Yeah, I was. I mean, yeah, I was going to add. Well, two things. One, I'll amplify what Brendan just said, which is for the journal. We're just interested in different creative ways to move through and past postmodernism. Doesn't all have to have the word meta modern in the title or anything like that. So, but the second thing I wanted to ask, or sort of ask you to elaborate a little bit more. And I know this is actually in your article, but I could hear a little bit more about it, is how capitalism fits in the history of economics and economic stages and phases that you've described to us. And I know you're going to associate it with the modern, but I wanted, but often if you were to read, I don't know, like a traditional Marxist economics, it would often go, hunter-gatherer, agriculture, feudal, capitalist, and then it would just sort of end. Like the narrative often ends with, and then maybe contemporary people after Marx have often fought over, is there a late stage capitalism, or has capitalism over and we're now in something worse, as one book had the title, Anyway, I would just love to hear a little bit more about how capitalism and various systems of exchange fit into to the various economic stages you're laying out. And then I also want to make sure that we underscore one of the things that I love about your project, which is that you're not just talking about historical stages, but layers. But anyway, I'll let you elaborate that in better terms than I can. And I'll put on my sunglasses because the sunlight is getting in my face again. One second.
So yeah, I mean, I include 4 layers of human economy into this concept, but underneath it is nature. And if you look to the classical economic theory, there's land and labor and capital, and I don't know if energy is in there, but somehow the economists pushed out the land, and it just became the capital and labor that went into the economic models. But we're nothing without the land and the forest and the trees and the plants and animals and all the stuff that we I mean, the materials and also the food that we need and the shelter and the energy for that matter. So so before there is human activity, there's nature, and we need to maintain nature. We need to regenerate nature. We need to make sure that we don't ruin it. And we're very much on the path towards doing that, which is a disaster. So we need an economic model that has nature inside it, underneath it. And I'm not the first to mention this. There's Kate Rayworth and there's Hazel Henderson and others have mentioned this. But underneath everything that we do, there is nature, or around it, inside it. So that's the first part. Then comes the human economy. And for 300,000 years in the hunter-gatherer Stone Age, or horticultural village, agricultural Stone Age, before anybody invented money, there was an exchange of goods and services, and there were very complex systems of remembering who owed what to whom. And there's a brilliant book by David Wengrow called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and I cannot recommend it enough because I learned so much from that book. And he describes how different civilizations, tribes, relatively big communities actually uh, could have, like, once per year everybody gathered and they mentioned everything that everybody owed to everybody, and then they sort of evened it out and figured out, so what would be the net result of this, and how can we settle this. And this exchange of goods and services and favors and giving gifts to each other, I mean, that goes back to the great apes. If you have a group of chimpanzees or gorillas, the way that they groom each other and owe each other favors and build alliances, we still do that. And that's part of the very foundation of how we interact with each other. And so it's very basic that we give gifts to each other in order to create connections and bond with people. And then, so I walk your dog, you help me paint my fence, or whatever it is. And until somebody invented money, that's what people kept doing. And then they sort of built up trust and community around it and a lot of wealth. But if we do it today in our neighborhood or among friends and family, and you suddenly introduce money, this whole gift economy falls apart, and it's very offensive actually to offer something, I mean, money for a favor. So there is something fundamentally human about this gift economy. There's an interesting thing about the word gift, because it's a present, but in the Scandinavian languages, it actually means poison. So there is a little bit of poison coming with this gift, because if you break the unspoken deal here, there's poison in our relationship. So it's very important that we maintain these exchanges and keep them going and learn how to play these, and very often unspoken rules, but also in some context spoken rules. Um, and so this is very foundational for the economy. So that would be the first human layer, and we still do it. I mean, we do it with family and friends, and we do it in neighborhoods and villages, and it's still around and is deeply meaningful. And when we don't have it, there is something crucial missing from our lives. Then comes the bigger communities, the ring-walled cities, or the artisan economy. And that's where we introduce money, because it's a very efficient way of exchanging things with strangers. Because if I have 20 eggs and you have a cow and somebody else has an amphora of wine, and nobody needs the whole cow and a full amphora of wine, and you both want 10 eggs, how do we deal with that without having this very complicated system of remembering who owes whom 10x or something like that? So that's where money uh, becomes, and it has taken different forms, but some kind of neutral means of exchange that everybody can use, and that represents value, makes the market economy possible. And you can go to the market and you can bring some of this money, or little pieces of gold or silver before it's actually uh, stamped and turned into coins. Um, and we can all trade using this means of exchange. And that's when you can have a big marketplace in a ring-walled city, and you can have, I don't know, 100, 200 different sellers and thousands of buyers walking around, and that's the market economy. And the market economy, and I actually found this in Windrove's book, and I forgot who came up with it, but the market economy is that you produce something, you take it to the market, sell it for money, and then you spend the money on something else that you need and that you can bring home with you. But capitalism starts with capital, and then you pool your money together so that you can produce something you can sell to get more money. So it's two different sort of mechanisms. And most of us are still just producers and participating in the market economy. When we go into the market and buy stuff, we're not capitalist in the sense that we own shares and just pool our money in order to extract more money from the market. But once we get to, and I think it was a part of colonialism actually, where people wanted to uh, buy ships and staff them and send them out into the world to steal stuff and make more money. And so not everybody could afford a ship of their own, so they pooled their money together, send out a ship, and it came home with gold and silver and all kinds of stuff, and then they made more money. So that was the beginning of capitalism. And with the steam engine, not everybody could afford a steam engine, so several people pooled their money together and bought a steam engine, built a factory, and made more money. And that's the capitalist system, and that's part of the modern economy. And in the artisan economy, the market economy, the traditional economy, you can individualize what you produce, and you can custom custom made everything. And so there's a quality to locally produced things, whereas in the capitalist modern industrialized economy, you can mass produce, and the whole purpose is to optimize the production so that you become more efficient and can produce more with less, which is actually really great because there's a lot of resources that are saved by that. But now we have reached the point where we're so efficient at producing, particularly as we have robots in the digital economy, and we have um, a global market, that we need to keep consuming to keep our jobs, which is completely absurd. And that's where the capitalist model and the modern economy has sort of reached its limit for solving problems. Now it's just creating more problems that it's solving. And in the West, I mean, besides the inequality, but if you look at the middle class, the upper middle class, um, we eat 4 or 5 times per day. We have access to fat, protein, sugar, and salt, and all kinds of really, really tasty stuff from around the globe. And then there are people who can't even, have 2 meals per day and have healthy food. And ironically, it's very much the poorest people who get overweight, and because there's so much sugar and fat in what they eat because it's so cheap to produce. So we have a production system, a capitalist economy that is so efficient that we overeat, we overconsume, and we need to keep consuming to be able to keep our jobs. And with robots and artificial intelligence, that is going to be even more extreme. And I have an example. I mean, economists love to have these sort of clear-cut examples that would never exist in the real world, but just to illustrate a point. So we can imagine that 8 billion people, built one big factory. One guy owns it, usually a man. One guy owns the factory that has all the machinery, all the robots, and the drones. And so it sends robots out into nature to bring in the resources, creates everything, puts it on drones, and sends it out into the world. And that's what everybody needs to consume. And we just need one person to turn on and off the factory every morning. I mean, that would be the ultimate efficiency. And we could probably, feed everybody with this gigantic factory with different departments around the globe extremely efficiently. And it could be powered by a nuclear power plant, and we would all get food and shelter and clothing and everything we need. So, what would the rest of us do? We could play instruments and we could hang out with our friends and stuff, but we wouldn't be part of that economy. And we would need to get our money from somewhere in order to buy the stuff coming out of the factory. We're not there yet, but the ultimate point or the singularity in the global economy, that would be it. And and anybody can tell that then we wouldn't have an economy anymore. Capitalism would be gone. The market economy would be gone, and we would start exchanging services and buying um, crafts that we had made because we liked them and because we would find it meaningful to, I don't know, carve our own cutlery or make our own ceramic cups or whatever it is, sew our own clothes, make art. So it will be a parallel economic system. And what's happening right now in the postmodern economy is that we have drones and robots and artificial intelligence. And if you look at something like Amazon, the workers are working under really horrible conditions, and there's a surplus of cheap labor and a middle class that just wants to buy everything as cheap as possible and have it delivered as quickly as possible anywhere, anything anywhere within half an hour. And once I think it's the aviation authorities in the US that won't let the drones deliver stuff yet, but the plan is there, and the technology is there. So we're on that path, and all the institutions, the economic models, the production lines, the economies, family economies of the middle and the working class are just not going to survive under that development. And that is part of what we're seeing mainly in the US, but there's a similar development in Europe. I bet they have the same thing in Australia and Japan also. So if we don't figure out how to have a healthy economy in the digital economy, the industrialized industry, capitalist economy, the traditional artisan market economy, and in the gift economy, we're going to see more people who are just falling out through the cracks in the economy and homeless in the street and on opioids, and that's a structural uh, flaw in the economy where we are right now, and we could have predicted that 20 years ago if we thought ahead. Oh, I've done my best, but it's a little bit late, I think. But we do need to figure out who would we like to be as a species? How do we want to live? Because we have all kinds of opportunities right now. I mean, we could, with a clever distribution of resources, taxation, um, economic development around the globe, we could have 8 billion people who got 3 healthy meals per day in meaningful communities, and with everybody having access to the global economy. Not everybody would have the means to have I don't know, a 1,000 square foot house or 1,000 square feet per person in the house. But everybody would be able to have roof over their head and access to clean water and sanitation and all that, and education and what makes life meaningful and fun. One of the challenges with the digital economy is digital currencies, because we don't have, I mean, what we think of as money is fiat money, and it's generally state government based currencies. So the United States has the dollar, the EU has the euro, and some of the nation states here have the euro as well. But Denmark has the krona, so does Sweden has the Swedish krona, and um, the money, the currencies are very much connected to state sovereignty and to the physical production of industry goods. But in a digital world where you can have cryptocurrencies that are exchanged with the real currencies, and you have a speculation economy plus the real economy and the digital economy, and the digital economy and the speculation economy are global, and you can just transmit code between countries. I mean, there are banks and there are institutions and there are credit cards and there is a structure that you can't just um, get around unless you get into the black economy and the dark economy. Um, but there are some structures here that none of our nation states have legislation or institutions for it. So part of this whole polymodern economics is also sort of a call for the nation states to wake up and say, well, how are we going to regulate this? How are we going to make sure that all the institutions that we have in the current states and all the local production and artisan economy and all the gift economies and the nature that we need to have a thriving nature around us. What are the institutions and the legislation and the global collaboration that we need in the 21st century now that we have a digital economy? And nobody is talking about this yet. I mean, there are some of the tech bros who are talking about how they can make more money with their technologies, but it's not like they talk about how can we make sure that everybody benefits from this and how can we regulate these companies so that everybody can thrive and nature can thrive. So that's the conversation that we need to have. So that is also what polymodern economics is about.
That's really helpful. And so, what would you make of this summary? Because one of the things I'm hearing you saying is that like the kind of modern capitalistic industrial mode of economic production seems to be having profoundly outsized kind of influence and sway over kind of economic production in general. And are you suggesting that a properly sort of polymodern economic vision would be one in which that sort of recedes to its sort of proper place, so to speak, that plays a meaningful function in a kind of global economy, but in such a way that it's not sort of pushing out the possibility for these artisanal economies and these other gift exchange economies, so that there's sort of a multiple economic modalities coexisting simultaneously in a almost kind of post industrial but still industrial kind of poly modern way. Is that kind of it?
Yes, all of
Yes.
the above. Yes. So the idea is that we need all of them because the digital technologies are here. And we do have digital transactions. I mean, we're having this conversation on Zoom, and this gives us opportunities that we didn't have 10 years ago. This is amazing. And we buy stuff on the internet and we trade and we have all kinds of services and cool stuff that we can have access to that it wasn't there before. Now it's here. So we need this digital economy. The problem is if it dwarfs the real economy. I mean, cyberspace can, in principle, expand exponentially indefinitely. And so can the cryptocurrencies if particularly if you get some artificial intelligence to invent stuff that other artificial intelligences start buying. And at some point, you can have an artificial intelligence that figures out the market and buys and sells everything in the real economy. And then you'll have an artificial intelligence that ends up with everything. And then capitalism is dead for another reason. So, so we need to figure out how can the digital economy coexist with the industrialized capitalist economy, with the artisan market economy, with the gift economy, and with nature? And we need all five of them, and they should all thrive. And at the national level, we have national governments, we have national legislation, then we do have some banking regulation agreements. There's Basel One, Basel Two, and Basel Three, and I have no idea what they actually say. But we do have these banking agreements and all the other um, global or at least international collaboration around currencies and the economy. But we don't have institutions for the digital economy, and right now it's like the Wild West. To use an old imagery of the sort of early capitalism, where the what do you call them, robber barons are going online and defining the future for all of us, and our democratic institutions are just sleepwalking into something that they where they lose power. And I don't know whether this is going to benefit anybody but a handful of tech billionaires, because that's the path we're on right now. And then you have people who have definitely been, I think the word is screwed by the current economy, and they vote for people who are not going to be able to solve the problems because they are losers in the existing economic system, and they used to be a thriving middle class, and so they've lost their sense of security, they've lost their sense of status, and they've just lost their savings, and they may be one health problem away from going personally bankrupt. Not as bad here, but we have a social welfare state that will face some of the same issues, and so we need to figure out how can we regulate what can be the transaction mechanisms between those different strata of a polymodern economy? Can there be local currencies in the um, artisan market economy that are maybe city-based or regional within a country, and then you have a national currency for the industrialized part of the economy, the capitalist economy, and then there are the cryptocurrencies that are global? I don't know, but we need some economists who have more resources and more experience with this than I do to try and figure out what would be a long-term sustainable, economically sustainable model where where there may be an exchange rate between city and state and between state and globe. I mean, today it's the U.S. dollar that is sort of the defining currency for global trade, but maybe it's going to be cryptocurrencies. And if that is so, then we'll all be sort of up against an algorithm that nobody. I mean, imagine if it's Bitcoin, then all the nation states will have to adjust themselves to an algorithm. And what we can do right now with currencies that are state-based, you can devaluate your currency if you have a deficit. I forgot the know I mean how this works. I mean, I'm not a economist, but I mean you can regulate your national economy relative to other economies by changing the exchange rate or the interest rate. But can you do that if it's a global a cryptocurrency that is the standard that everybody is trading up against? And I mean, what you can do today is that you can buy up foreign currency, or you can sell the foreign currency that you have as a state in order to regulate your local economy. But if we're all regulating up against the same cryptocurrency, how will that work? And how many times can you do that? I mean, if you had a state that went out and just bought Bitcoin right now in order to earn a lot of money and be able to cover their state deficit 10 years from now, and then they would sell all their Bitcoin in 10 years and get their get out of their debt. Um, they would only be able to do that once. So there's some, I don't even know what the consequences are of this, but we need to think it through.
Mm.
And I don't hear any macroeconomists who address this at the, I would say, global economic existential level,
Mhm.
because that is really what we need to deal with. And but so that's sort of the really big picture. At the more concrete level, I hope that if we had these five strata of the economy: nature, gift economy, artisan economy, industry economy, and digital economy, um, we could favorize local production and having raw materials that are locally produced, produce, and also local employment, and you could give tax deductions on buying locally, which means that we could have very strong local communities and local economies. And what I hope we could also see is that if you had, say, I'll just use Copenhagen as an example, we're about 1 million people, and there's sort of 4 or 5 big parts of the city that are defining themselves slightly. I mean, they're not that different, but they do have sort of a local flavor. You could have a part of Copenhagen with 200,000 people who had a very distinct artisan community of, say, furniture designers and furniture production and other interior design stuff, and maybe all the vegetarian restaurants. And then you would have another part of Copenhagen where you would have more of a outdoors. I mean, I live very close to the beach in Copenhagen, so you would have all the water sports and the fish restaurants. Not that anybody fishes here. Well, there is a small fishing village south of where I'm. Sort of different clusters of artisans and local communities, and you could have an art community, you could have a musical community, you could have different. So you could actually have like a go on a weekend trip to another part of your own city and experience something different from your own part of the city, or you could just take the car for 20 minutes and have a weekend stay in a different town or different city, and it would be like being a tourist. They would have something that you don't have in abundance where you live. Instead of, as a lot of people do, unfortunately, get on an airplane and go to London for the weekend or New York for the weekend. Not a lot of people do that, but that's not sustainable. And what it's about is to have a good experience with your family or your partner and experience something other than in your own neighborhood. And we could have these much more complex and interesting cityscapes if we had local economies that were actually local. And as I said, we get what we measure. And so what I suggest that we can measure is local complexity and the what kind of local exchanges, national exchanges, and continental exchanges, but also the private exchanges in the gift economy. Um, what is the network? What are the connections between people in the gift economy, local locals and their local service providers and artisans in the local economy, the connection to the national economy and how many connections there are there, trade within the country, and of course also export imports, but then also at the continental level. And if we had a measurement of the number of connections that people have over the course of a day or a month or a year, I bet that we could compare neighborhoods across the globe. We could compare local economies across the globe, and we could compare national economies across the globe in a much more meaningful way, because we could measure complexity and have the number of connections as a sort of proxy for thriving. And where we have money exchange, you could measure the number of trade money exchanges. But where we don't have the money exchange, we could have surveys of, say, how many people did you speak to yesterday, how many meals did you serve to other people yesterday, how many of your local um, how much care did you give yesterday, how many minutes of unpaid care did you provide to kids, parents, whatever. And if we saw that as exchanges or transactions and had these surveys, I bet that we could also see in which neighborhoods and smaller communities people were thriving due to the number of connections, and where they would not have a lot of connections and would have perhaps even drug abuse, but definitely a lot of psychological problems. So I think we could have a completely different look at society, and not just economic thriving, but also human thriving. And we could have a more interesting world, and you could decide whether you would be in the part of the city that has all the cool restaurants and the furniture design, or you would go to the part of the city where they have all the music and theater venues. You see that in cities already, but we could make it even more explicit, and we could plan accordingly. And the artisan economy, the local economy, is basically what is also called, or is a different model called the 15-minute city. And I live in a 15-minute city. I can walk or bicycle to pretty much everything that I need on a day-to-day basis within 15 minutes. And that includes downtown Copenhagen and the beach. So and it's cool. I mean, there are so many weeks where I don't move beyond that. I have everything here. And I got rid of my car 5 years ago. And I haven't missed it more than one time.
So I'll just jump in here real quick for a sec, because a lot of really interesting things that you've just said, and I have to go in a couple of minutes. So first, I want to underscore the urgency of the dilemma that you articulate, both in the paper and in what we're talking about. To put it in pretty succinct terms, the current economic model is unsustainable, both because we are literally destroying the planet in pursuit of higher GDP, and also because a combination of increasing wealth inequality and actually, in a way, more intensified forms of capitalism are undergird are sort of destroying most of the globe. And basically, capitalist logics dictate that whenever something is profitable, you should choose the more profitable option. And it turns out that what that leads to is an economy in which actually suffering has been maximalized, in contrast to, well, a couple of people get rich, if it's not regulated in some way or another, because otherwise, but it's the reason that the internet has become enshittified, to take the technical term, because anywhere you can make a buck, you make a buck, and then basically you want to charge people up to the limit that they will pay. And so, of course, that turns out to be, for certain necessities, really terrible. You can charge people a lot for clean water, it turns out, if it's not nationalized, because people need it, or whatever. So and I like your sense of the multiple layers of the economy, the gift economy, which, of course, discussed in depth, but also Marshall Solins's Stone Age economics, and Marcel Mauss's famous work on the gift, but also, the history of the artisanal economies, etc. I think that there's also been, pushes toward regenerative economics, or sustain or degrowth economics, but those are still riding only at this top level. And what I like is that you're really finding different ways to think about emphasizing the local. And I think that that's another key piece that I find really valuable in your work, which is that there's a tension between, again, the economic, transnational or world system economics, to borrow Emmanuel Wallerstein's discussion of the world system, where what tends to happen is, in an older, let's say, national capitalist economy, you might have the exploited class within the country. But now the systems of exploitation have gone global, and so, and to benefit a small elite who are, increasingly trained. And we had, Pandora Papers leak that showed all these tax havens all over the globe, and nothing was done, basically. So, the global system is broken in some fundamental ways. I wanted to know, I've only, your gesture to complexity. This came out recently, and I'm only through the introduction, but it's J. Doyne, I think he's pronounced Farmers. It's a complex, making sense of chaos, a better economics for a better world. It's actually complexity economics. And so far, what he's trying to do is take complexity theory, which is something Brendan and I have been discussing, and I know you refer to in your article, and try and think about it as a positive economic model. And I think that there's room for a lot of different, he sort of presents it, at least in the introduction, as though it will necessarily go one way. But I think what we could note is that, just as you were saying, what we measure is very important, and there are many different levels at which we might measure complexity. So there are a multiplicity of possible complexity economies, and we have to be very careful about thinking about what ones we want to bring into existence, or advocate for. And I think taking very seriously, for instance, the environment and the natural world is going to be step one. okay, yeah. I guess I'll with that comment, I probably need to hop off soon to go to my other Zoom meeting. But I think Brendan will continue the conversation with you. But I just love the piece, and I think I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about pragmatically what a polymodern economics would look like. And I think you've talked a little bit about what it looks like as you know, in terms of how changing what one measures and changing to an emphasis on the local and the tensions between different scales. For instance, the local,
Right.
et cetera, would shape the what we were aiming for insofar as a state was producing economic policy. I'd love to hear about other ideas. I won't be. I'll have to duck out before I hear the answer, but maybe I can start you on that path, and then I'll fade it into the background in 2 minutes or so and vanish. But very, very important stuff that you're thinking about, and I think all of us here today can't afford to ignore the broad crisis that the global economy is in, because yeah, we could have by all capitalist measures, a complete success, and that would also turn out to be terrible for most of the people living in the country, so or living in the globe. Not to mention all the systems of exploitation that capitalism has historically been built on, including, as you mentioned, slavery and colonialism and other things. So, anyway, okay, I'll step back for a second.
So, well, yeah, thank you. I mean, the problem with capitalism is that it needs growth to not collapse. So we need to grow the money mass and the debt and the interest that is paid back on the debt. So um, we need to figure out how can we keep a healthy economy without having it collapsing all the time. And the interesting thing, whenever there is a collapse, like 2008, for instance, the cars were still there, the houses were still there, the fields were still there, people were still there. What collapsed? Trust in the system. So it's really about the expectations of what kind of money will be left in the system to pay back the debt and the interest on the debt. And whenever people lose trust in or confidence in people being able to pay back their debt, it collapses. And so we need regulations, and that's why we have these. I mean, there used to be all these regulations, and before, what was his name, Greenspan, I think, got rid of them, and that's why there was the collapse in 2008, because people had learned from the past. So we can learn from the past. We can regulate. One of the things, and I don't know how that would work in practice, but I do suggest it in the article, is that um, you can register your company or your organization as either part of the artisan economy or the industry economy, and you can be taxed accordingly, for instance, so that there can be higher taxes. There could also be a tax on market share, so that if you're a startup, you don't pay any corporate tax, but if you start gaining market share, you start paying a corporate tax. How that would work out in practice and the paperwork that would go into that, that would probably be hell, and designing that would probably fail a number of times, and people would it would be extremely hard to administer this in the organizations. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but we need to rethink how we do things and how can we contain capitalism so that capitalism can solve the problems that it's good at solving. Because I mean, if you can pool, if you can actually bring your money together and create something that wasn't there before, that's amazing. And if you can be paid for you're willing to take that financial risk, that's amazing, because otherwise nobody would just offer their money for something that you're not certain what the outcome is going to be. So there's a lot of positive things to be said for capitalism, but has reached its limit and its usefulness in the current system. So we need to figure out how can we contain it, how can we get the best out of it, and how can we get the best out of all the digital opportunities that are there, and not least, how can we provide the energy for it so that we won't end up in a situation where we have the money sucking up all the energy, and the rest of us will just sit there with a field and a shovel and have to go pick up water in a bucket every morning because all the energy goes into maintaining the money system. So we need to rethink this from the really big perspective, and also appreciate and that is why we need all five layers. I mean, appreciate the richness of nature. I mean, look at this amazing planet that we're in, and uh, we can't um, we can't protect it if we don't love it and care about it. So we need to factor it in, and then there's all the care and unpaid work that currently doesn't get the respect that it deserves for two reasons. One, there's no money involved in it, and the other one is it's the women's stuff. So it's not the real economy because that's what the men are doing. Um, but none of us would be here if it hadn't been for all that free care that we got from the adults around us and from our neighbors and people who just cared about us. So we need to rethink this and we need to do it better. And I would say my article here is a suggestion for a different kind of conversation about what should the economy look like in the 21st century and as we move forward.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, just a few quick thoughts of my own real quick before we wrap this up. One of the things that does kind of stick out to me in what you're saying is that you are finding a place for and a value for capitalism while also recognizing its sort of its limits. And that to me does strike me as a kind of meaningful synthesis. I know you want to be more expansive than any kind of modern and postmodern thing, but very simplistically and crudely, you could say that to the degree that capitalism is sort of at the heart of the modern economy that gets going, you know, in the 1600s and moves beyond that, then the kind of postmodern reaction to that does tend to favor kind of anti-capitalist sentiments of sort of, you know, moving towards the end of capitalism, and of course there are different forms of Marxism that have been picked up in some of that political struggle, and of course those have reached their limit as well, leading to some of the confusion and aporia of kind of late postmodern thought of like, what do we do now? Is this the only option for us? This sort of a thing. And so one of the things that you're narrating seems to be of value, is that, you know, it's not necessarily envisioning the total end of capitalism, but more like the putting of capitalism in its proper place so that it can be part of a more sustainable, holistic framework. And that to me, again, strikes at me as a sort of meaningful dialectical bringing together, a synthesis of some of those
I would
key.
even be willing to calling that a meta-modern capitalism.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
okay.
yeah.
Well, and then one last quick thought, though we don't really have time to get into this, but I've been intrigued by the way also in which uh, there's a shift that happens in the 1970s in America where we go off the gold standard. And one of the things
Yep.
that this allows is basically for fiat currency to be untethered to real physical phenomena in the world, right?
Yep. Yep. Gold.
Yeah, and so there's an interesting connection to be made, and to some degree is made in David Harvey's work, The Condition of Postmodernity, I think it's called. Excellent book where he gets really into a sort of Marxist analysis of the economic transition from Fordism into this kind of more commodified system. But what's really interesting though is there's an interesting parallel to postmodern thought in general, which is sort of this decoupling from reality, right? There's sort of like it's the simulacra, it's you know, this kind of move towards anti-realism. It's the idea that the surface is more true than the depth. It's this idea that, like, you know, appearance is just as good as reality. All that stuff, right? It's sort of like those distinctions are collapsed, and then there's this sort of fake wonder fantasy land we can all live in just through kind of social construction as much as we want to. Sort of, I'm obviously crudely, you know, simplifying here, but that's kind of a caricature. And I think you could view some of the economic developments in a similar light of, you know, if we are no longer tethered to some aspects of reality, well, maybe we do just run up the debt, print a lot of fake money, and then don't think about the future and get ourselves into a lot of trouble economically and just kind of keep trying to run out the clock. And so I see some kind of meta-modern or polymodern future here as being a return to reality. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that needs to be some return of a gold standard or anything like that, but maybe it is in these blockchain cryptocurrencies, you know, where there is some kind of transparent connection to something going on in the world rather than just fiat. It's an interesting thing, and I don't have the kind of expertise to really back that up with a lot of sound argumentation and evidence, but it's more of a superficial analog that I see, and just wanted to mention that while we were talking about all this. Any thoughts on that briefly before we kind of wrap this up? Either of those points?
I mean, there is somehow we need to connect the cryptocurrencies with nature, because we need to have a thriving nature, a thriving planet. And we need food and we need care and we need meals and shelter and all that stuff. And we do need dentists and bakeries and local artisans of various kinds, people who can repair things that doesn't work anymore. And we do need the industry production of, I don't know, shoes and paint and car tires and tons of things, cars for that matter. And we do need the digital now that it's there. Probably one that we could lose the easiest, because we did survive for a long time without it. We can't survive without nature. We can't survive without care and food.
Mm.
So there has to be some kind of anchoring both the capitalist economy, the fiat money, and the cryptocurrencies in nature. And I don't know how to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I admit that, because it would take a lot of people thinking this through and having more, I mean, numbers and algorithms to number crunch things, and also bring it together in. I mean, there's population growth, and there's population decline, and there's migration. There's all these things, and then there's the whole issue of education, because
Mm.
it's one thing to have an underdeveloped economy with a lot of illiterate people in a gift economy that barely has any artisan economy in parts of Africa, for instance, and then having a postmodern digital globalized economy where, in order to just have any kind of uh, digitally related job, you need, I don't know, 20 years of education. So there are some enormous problems here with how do we transition into a globe where this is balanced, and where the biggest hope for 2 billion people is not to leave where they are and go to Europe, because we can't have them. And it's not because I don't like people from other parts of the world. It's just not going to be, you know, sustainable one way or the other. So we do need to figure out how can we create global economic development so that people want to stay where they are, and when they want to leave, it's because they want to come back to where they are. Um, because that's how we can
Yeah.
survive as a species.
Yeah, no, and it starts to tie in a lot of other kind of current global crises, that are all interrelated as these crises are, maybe even in a meta crisis sort of way of migration and climate change, these other things, which certainly we don't have time to get into. But I also, before we do end, I just want to give a quick shout out to Steph McCurdy, who I know is interested in this question that you brought up of tying this back to nature, and particularly potentially through cryptocurrency. If we had a kind of thermodynamics approach to economics, then we're actually from the ground up engaging everything in energy consumption. And if you think about that as the
Right.
ultimate currency, it's really interesting to consider what the future of currency, financial currency, could look like if we were actually able to ground it in that. Fascinating stuff, and it points us towards so many important topics and the future for economic theorists like yourself. And anyway, not enough time to get into all this, but maybe you'll submit another paper in the future and we can have another opportunity to get into this then. But yeah, thank you so much, Lena Rachel Andersen. Much appreciated. Love this article. And we will be continuing the series with other contributors. But thanks again for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Take care.